leaving messages. Hi, Sandy.
Happy New Year.
Happy 2023. How are you?
Hashtag bring on 2023. I am good. And as we tape this, which will be a few days before it drops, we're going on 3 feet of snow in Durango.
Oh, wow. Wow, how much fun.
Yeah. Yeah. The
That's
dog
good.
loves it. You got
Good.
to watch your footing. It's fun to play in. We live in a place where we can play in it. I don't need to drive. So at least for the next couple of days, but it's beautiful. But yeah.
Good. All right. So today we're going to talk about things we take for granted. And you having snow, do you ever take for granted the snow or the not snow or the being able to get around better or um, does does that resonate with you at all?
I think what resonates with me is I used to complain about the snow or a weather change. And I really appreciate the change of seasons and just like seasons of life, right? I, it's not going to be here forever. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I take for granted sometimes the beauty of it rather than the annoyance of it.
Right, right. Get it. I get it. Because I will tell you, the beginning of snow is always beautiful, but by the last days of snow, it's like it's dirty, it's gross. You just
Right.
want it to go away. At least that's what I always think of at the end. All right. So what we take for granted. So this came to mind when I've been starting over here in Kansas City with my business. And I had this real optimism going into it of, oh, it's all going to be okay. Oh, it's going to be great. It's going to be, there was this optimism, which there's still some optimism, but I'm now getting that balance of reality of, all right, so maybe I took for granted my
Mm-hmm.
network of people that I knew in Omaha to get business with. So there were things that I was like, oh, maybe I was a little too optimistic and took some of that stuff for granted. So that's why this topic has kind of come up as talking, for us to kind of talk about the things we do take for granted and what have been our checks to kind of balance that and make us appreciate it more. So I have some examples. I'm sure you do too. Thoughts?
Initial thought is when you brought this up and you were telling me your feelings about things that you had taken for granted, that we never is a strong word. We many times don't think about these things that we're taking for granted until they're gone. So,
Yeah.
that's the sad part because people, when they feel like they've taken people or friendships or relationships for granted, they usually notice it once that person is gone. Right. And it's kind of a
Right.
sad time because it's like, oh, wow, that I didn't realize how great it is. So I think my big thing is when you brought that up to me, it was kind of an awakening with myself of thinking about things that I'm enjoying now that aren't gone, kind of like the snow, right? And
Right.
oh, I shouldn't take them for granted. So it's a good challenge
Yeah.
too, because typically it's when something's gone that we realize
Yeah.
it, right? So it's appreciating it in the now too.
And I will tell you, you can appreciate things in the now and still have this, missing them and knowing that you still took them for granted. Like
Right.
there's still like I had so much gratitude for my friends, for like I always feel like I'm in this space of gratitude, but I still was taking things for granted. Does that
It,
make sense?
it
Like,
does make sense. So give an example. You talked about networking friends. Is there a specific instance that happened or story that started to trigger it for you, or was it everything
um,
at once?
well, I was going through things. I found some mini articles. I was going through things that we take for granted. And one of the things was, well, we always talk about health. We
Right.
take our health for granted and somebody said, well, if you could go for a walk, you should be grateful. And then there are people who take that for granted. And I'm always grateful that I can go out, be outside, walking, experiencing things. One of the things that was said was travel. Like if you can plan trips and go on fun trips that you've always wanted to go on, you should be grateful and not take that for granted, because there are millions of people who never get to travel for fun, never get to travel. And so it's kind of stuff like that. That's what got me thinking.
And things like what just triggered with me with you saying that, things like travel. Are you enjoying it as much if you're taking it for granted? Because you're likely nitpicking the little things like, my flight was delayed, I forgot to pack this, because you're not thinking about the gratitude of something you have that someday you may not have, that other people don't have.
Yeah.
It doesn't bring out the happiest part of it, right? Or working out, the walking. I talk about that all the time. My
Yeah.
mental thing to myself when I'm running is, be happy you can do this. Because,
Right.
and I see that more and more now, because I run with a group of ladies who are older than me. They're not as old as they're about halfway between me and my mom. So they're good 10 years older than me. And they talk about all the time how their friends drop like flies from running, because you can only do it, your body can only take it for so long. And then they move on to swimming, right? But they talk about that. And it's a constant reminder to me of, do not complain. Be happy that not only can I do it, but I can do it without a lot of pain. So it sure changes the perspective of my enjoyment factor in doing things when I don't take them for granted.
Right. My husband and I, we have this thing where we say, that's a very first world problem you're having right now. And
I love
it's
it.
about us taking stuff for granted, like we're complaining, if you're complaining about something with your travel, I didn't get something with my meal. Oh, first world problem there. I think we're going to survive, be grateful for what you do have.
So Amy, here's one that I don't think about it very often. We talk about the normal ones: health, youth,
Yeah.
love. There's some that immediately come to mind for taking for granted. I had told you that I was finishing the audiobook Spare with Prince Harry, which I loved.
Yeah.
And quite frankly,
Yes.
I don't care about what all the royals say. I listened to it not because of any of the monarchy. I wanted to hear human story. I wanted to hear him as a human, not him as a prince. But one thing that just resonated with me the whole time, what we take for granted? Peace, quiet, solitude, being able to have a life that is not in a fishbowl all the time. I think people think they don't want that. They want to be that celebrity, that person. But most people that are in that situation said they'd do anything to have what we have for peace and solitude, but they didn't know it until they didn't have it. Right.
Right. So that's that. I'm looking forward to reading that book because that's on my list. I was just watching the Good Morning America this morning, and there's a gymnast, a college gymnast from LSU, who is a TikTok star. Okay. She is doing that name and likeness. She's got sponsors. She's like making millions of dollars as a college gymnast. Okay.
Oh, can you do that? I guess you
Yes.
can't on TikTok, but you can as a college gymnast.
You can now because that name and likeness, that the new thing where they can have sponsors and things like that.
I need to catch
So
up.
that's legal.
Okay, good.
Yes, so that's so it's legal. So but she is so popular that they're having to have security around the gymnast, and that her fans are starting to disrupt other gymnasts performing, because with gymnastics there's different things going on all the time, and if they're really noisy and cheering for her, then the other people on different apparatuses can't perform or can't focus as well. And so they're being very disruptive. And it was this whole thing about how she's really thriving, but now it's like they have to do all of this stuff to make it an equal playing ground for everybody to be able to compete. And it was just interesting, the conversation. And I think it was also, you take for granted that people can have that space to compete without the interruption and stuff
Right.
like that.
You take it for granted.
Yeah.
And most people that have the super security, the heightened, always thought that's a place they wanted to be and what they wanted, but they question the trade-off.
Right. Exactly.
They
And
question
you
the
don't
trade-off.
realize it until it's gone. Like
Right.
that trade-off, like you thrive for it. And then when that peace is gone and that safety, sometimes safety disappears because there's crazy people out there. So
But not listening
then,
to our podcast. We talked about
yeah,
that
no,
last
no,
time
no,
too.
none of
One
our
of
pod
those.
listeners are, no, or us, but that safety and stuff. One of the things that I thought of too is infrastructure type items like roads. I'm watching California and they're losing roads to mudslides. And I am water. We had a water main break in the city a couple of weekends ago. And we got a water notice like, don't you need to boil water? And it was
Really?
for about, it was not quite 48 hours, but it was like a day and a half. And that was a little bit like, okay, well, this is interesting. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
I've always trusted my water supply. I've always, we've trusted that our roads will be there to get us in and out. I saw somebody this morning had a zip line in California to get across where they thought they had thankfully put in a zip line to cross the river because they thought the bridge would probably washed away. I know.
Well, freedoms. I think one big thing a lot of people take for granted that they take for granted, they fight for it. It's all good, you be you, but freedoms are something we have as Americans that especially anybody who's not American looks at the typical American and says we take that for granted. And the story I have for that is one of my sons for work needed to go to Shanghai and Thailand, and he was gone for a couple of weeks. And he's not a person who worries about things, but the freedoms, not the freedoms he was giving up, the stringent laws and rules they have and the freedoms that are taken away from people were really stressing him out in thinking through what if he did something wrong that's okay here but not okay there. Like, how do you ever go through that whole list if I do? He was really stressing himself out. And even when he went there, when people said you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that, and it really made him appreciate the freedoms we have here. And it got me to thinking too, it's like, wouldn't that have been good for a lot of us to go through something like that? Not just a cushy country, but a country that has more rules and less freedoms, to understand what it would be like to live somewhere else. Because I think that will stay with him forever.
Right. I'm sure it's like the women journalists who travel to the Middle East and they have to dress completely differently,
right?
Because otherwise they're not accepted into the room unless they.
And it's punishable. So you can think about the gentleman, and I never really heard what happened with him, the reporter who died suddenly of the cardiac arrest during the soccer. And he was wearing a rainbow. There's a lot of controversy because he was so pro gay and he was doing pride things, and that was illegal there in wherever he was at. And it's not just that you're not accepted, but you're putting yourself at stake too. You're putting your livelihood, your freedoms at stake when you're in another country by doing that. But I think a lot of us take that for granted.
Oh, completely. Until we hear a story or know somebody who's experienced something. Speaking of stuff like that, even in the United States, my son Trevor's in boot camp right now. And part of boot camp is you pretty much go with the clothes on your back and you have nothing and you have no access to anybody. He doesn't have his phone. He doesn't have free time for 10 weeks, might be a little bit less, 9 weeks maybe. He has no contact. There, we have occasional, we've gotten like 3 phone calls, and
Mhm.
that's probably all we're going to get. We get letters, but he has no free time. He has no, like, here's a funny story for him. Last time he called, he was talking about gift packages we could send him. And I was like, oh, I didn't know we could send you a package. And he's like, yeah. He's like, yeah, you can put like cough drops in it. I was like, cough drops. So I started laughing. I was like, so you want cough drops? He's like, yeah, like the ones that are like candy, because you can't send candy, you can't send food, you can't send. So he wanted cough drops and chapstick. That's like all he really wanted. And he goes, yeah, like cough drops are like gold here because you can barter for things. And I was like, well, what are you bartering for? And he said band-aids. And I was started laughing.
Oh
I
my
was like,
gosh.
I go, do you want me to send you some band-aids? So anyway, um, and I was thinking in that moment, the things I would take for granted and that he's taken for granted for this small period of time, he has none of that. Like he is just really, and they're providing, he said they're eating great, but they're exercising a ton and just anything. He has no access to his phone, nothing. So, yeah, it's just interesting.
That's awesome. I mean, it really is. Think about it. I'm comparing this to having one of my kids texting me because life is stopping because they can't get it in Netflix, or do you have the Apple code? It got text to you, the sky is falling. They're not bartering for Band-Aids. And I'm not
No,
far
no.
from them. So, I mean, I'm, not shaming them.
You're
So,
right, right.
I mean,
Yes.
interesting thought that came to mind when you and I were talking about this. I had an example of what has come to light for me for taking things for granted. And it's not one of those things necessarily. For me, it's not something that I've lost, but it's something that's so normal. I just assume everybody has had the same experience. Okay. So, sometimes you can call that privilege, right? Because
Right.
you
Yeah.
just don't know that not everybody has the same privilege experience that you have. But my story is I spend all this time with my mom, now my dad with his 8mm tapes, and I have been taking, in the past it was photos, stories, but the most recent thing is these 8mm tapes from the 60s and 70s and converting them to short clips. And what I did over Christmas is I tried to find all the Christmas clips. I thought, oh, we're going to get all the Christmas clips done. That will be fun, to share. And what I learned is people really enjoyed, it wasn't so much my family, but reliving 1970 Christmas, the yarn tree, they could relate to the different objects, the hairdos, and they were seeing their own Christmases. But the other thing that came out of it was so many comments about, you had the all-American family. You're so lucky to have your family. People saying to me in private, boy, I remember observing my friends having families like that. I took for granted this upbringing I had and this very cohesive, close parents who there was no doubt that they loved each other, were always caring to each other. Our grandparents, both sets being within, walkable, rideable distance. My little storybook Norman Rockwell life was all I knew, but I've taken that for granted, is what I've come to believe, because I always believed that's what most everybody else had. And what I'm finding out is that's not the case. And so I'm much more in tune to how lucky I am and how grateful I am for my parents, my grandparents, my brothers, my aunts and uncles. So the gratitude is much better once I was able to understand that it was something I was taking for granted.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. I think what I've come to the realization is sometimes we don't realize we're taking things for granted. And I think we started with as until they're gone, or until somebody points
Points it
out
out.
how lucky we were to have that. And then
Right.
it's like, oh yeah, I am lucky to have that, or were to have that, or whatever. I had a moment with my health. I remember when I was in my the mid 20s, late 20s, I guess. Reagan was just like a year old, and I had a bad pap smear. And I had never had a bad pap smear before. And that's one of those things that, oh my gosh, what
Mhm.
is this? It's like a bad mammogram. It's like a something that, and then it all turned out fine. But I remember getting the notice that I had to go in for a more extensive testing, and my brain just spiraling about, oh my gosh, what if I'm sick? What if I'm not here for my child anymore? What if, like, it was just this whole,
Right.
and I remember feeling so much gratitude when everything came back normal. It was like, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful. I'm not going to lose any of that stuff. Like, I'm still going to be here. I still have my health. And um, it's not bad to have those moments to give us that check
Mhm.
and to remind us to be grateful and not to take things for granted. I think that's what I learned from that moment. And I don't have those moments often, but when you do, it's I think worth acknowledging that you've been taking something for granted and you need to like reappreciate it or start
Oh,
appreciating it or whatever it is.
how long did that stick for you, Amy? You know, how all of a sudden you think, oh my gosh, I feel this gratitude, but it wears off, right? Because you get back in the same. How long did
Right.
that, is it something that stuck with you, or did you feel like it slowly went back to normal where you weren't thinking with that level of gratitude anymore?
Yes, it went back to normal. But it revisits whenever I have anything, whenever I hear of somebody being diagnosed with something, it
Mhm.
always reappears of that. Okay, so which, I hate to say that other people's misery or problems bring on my gratitude, but it is like a little bit of a, okay, I had my mammogram, it was clear. Thank you for that. So I would say every time I have testing, but that specific incident, I would say probably a good solid month, I was like, I am so grateful. And then it started wearing off.
And it is interesting, how quickly we forget and move on. Um,
Yeah.
but then how then it comes back to us too. So my thing was literally just last week, I got called back in for, they don't call it a bad mammogram anymore or a negative. They call it inconclusive when they call you back in, because then people don't panic as much. So, and that's what she told me. She said, we really like to call it inconclusive rather than negative. But when you come back in,
Yeah.
we're going to do an ultrasound and we're gonna go and look deeper, because really until they biopsy it or something, it really is kind of inconclusive. So when I went back, I was pretty chill about it. I think part of that's age, and it's like, it was also helpful when the doctor's office called and said, look, you're going to get a call from the hospital and they're going to say negative, that it came back bad. But that's when she explained the inconclusive. They don't have an answer. So just so you know, long story short, I'm fine. Okay. Get that off
Good.
the table. But
I'm glad to hear. I'm glad to
as I
hear.
was waiting in the room for the ultrasound tech to come in, because they did another mammogram on one side, then they got some specific views and they're going to do the ultrasound. And as I waited, I laid there and looked up and I just had this incredible flashback to something I haven't thought about forever. My first pregnancy was a miscarriage, and I was probably 12 or 14 weeks. Let's just go with 12. And when I was in the room waiting for my DNC, I remember staring up at the ceiling, and my worry was, will I ever have kids? Will
Yeah.
Can I go through this again? All those things. But then I have 3 healthy kids and the kids grow
Yeah.
up, and I completely forgot about that loss and that miscarriage and that first pregnancy. And I'm like, so that would have been, I think I figured out it would have been 31 years ago. And I'm like, here I am alive 31 years later with grown, healthy children. But at the time, I was devastated and didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But how interesting how I
Right.
forgot about that.
Interesting. My first pregnancy ended the same way. And I will tell you, that is one of those things that you spirals you, especially the first, because mine was like at 14 weeks because we'd gone in at 12 weeks and all was good. And then
You
it
went quite a
wasn't.
ways.
But so it was, but because then we had Reagan, and then I had another one, but it was not as late. It was earlier in between Reagan and Taylor. And I will tell you, the second miscarriage didn't affect me like the first one because I had Reagan to prove that I could like I was like, oh well, I can have children.
Right.
It just
And I
like
have
this, and I have one. This one just didn't work. And then, so I remember that I have that exact same feeling from that first pregnancy. And it did kind of go away for me too. And that I don't think that I'm taking my children for granted with that one going away. It's more of a celebration of them, that
right.
they're healthy, they're well, I'm thriving, they're thriving. I don't want to discount what we went through, but it doesn't hurt like it did because things turned out okay for us.
Isn't it interesting, Amy, how it's almost a struggle between resilience, taking things for granted, rallying back, all those things that we talk about. Like, I remember my sister-in-law will still bring up the fact that she's in healthcare. I went into the doctor's office and had a DNC with no anesthesia. And she's like, that doesn't happen. And I'm like, I just wanted to move on. Right. And yeah. I kind of glorified in that and the fact that I did move on. And, there was this, rather than saying, boy, I'm not going to take something for granted, I glorified the resilience. So do those two things clash? Are we supposed to be warriors and happy and move on and not think about taking things for granted? They seem like contrary principles, don't they?
They do. I completely agree because I was having the same thoughts about optimism and taking things for granted because optimism, it's all going to be good, which true, it could all be good, but you could still miss things and still regret things. You could still have yes, I know it's kind of this reality check and then this hopefulness, so that you've got to balance the two.
The great thing about not taking things for granted or putting things in perspective, all the things that are important to you in your life and just kind of doing an assessment, which is what I did after you brought it up, you sure find more joy in the daily things by doing that. It makes for a happier daily life. It makes for a happier in relationships because I think many times it's like, oh, I'm so lucky to have my husband, rather than thinking, he did not put the clothes in the dryer, or why do I walk the dog all the time, right? If I'm not taking it for granted and I think about how lucky I am, you don't sweat the small stuff as much, right? Which leads for a more joyful, happier life.
Yes. Yes.
Making this a Pollyanna episode once again.
I know. Here we are. Here we are again.
Here we are again.
All right. So let's wrap this up with what's the real and what's the ideal in this?
Well, Amy, you go first. You pick which one, because you've been thinking about this, especially with it's been top of mind for you. How about that?
All right. So I have been thinking about this a lot. So the real is that we can be as grateful and as optimistic as possible as we want to be, but we're still going to be taking things for granted, and we won't know what those are until they're gone. And I think we just have to forgive ourselves for that and know that it's going to happen. I think that's the reality is I took water for granted. So there's going to be things that we take for granted, and it's just human nature. I think that's the real.
Mhm. No matter how hard we try, it's gonna happen.
Right. Something. And
Right.
just hopefully it's not everything.
Right.
Right. Yeah. What
And
about you?
I think you nailed it on the reel. For as much as we say, I'm going to do an inventory every day and I'm going to be grateful, I'm not going to let that happen to me. I'm not. No more finding out later. You don't know what you don't know sometimes, right?
Well
I
said.
took youth for granted. I'm sorry. I had no idea some of this stuff was going to happen. I took it for granted. Um, I took it for granted. But I think the ideal is at any point in time, we can take an inventory of our lives and take a step back and say, here are the good things about what I have. Here's what it could be like. And try to, and especially when you are sweating the small stuff. I think when you're that's usually when you're taking things for granted, is when you're getting mad, upset over petty things. Back to you and Tom's point about first world problems, right? Third world problems. Which world are their problems?
First
First
world.
world problems.
And
Thank you.
we are living in the
We're
first world.
world as opposed to the third world. Okay, got it.
Yes,
But
this is not a real problem.
this is not a real problem. But then think about it. I think the ideal is thinking about the first world problem perspective. Am I taking this for granted? Am I taking this other person for granted, the situation, or the conveniences of life?
Yes. Yes.
And
I
you'll be a
love that.
happier person for it.
Yes, I hope so. Right, we all hope so. All right. Well, thank you, Sandy. What a great conversation to kick off 2023. And hopefully we can all live in gratitude and not taking things for granted as much as possible.
And then we have a lot of things to be thankful for and to reflect on, right?
Yes, we do.
Bring on
All right.
2023. Bye, Amy.
Bye. Thanks.